Before we begin this incredible true story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss another amazing story like this one. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Grand Plaza as thousands of citizens gathered for the annual Independence Day ceremony. Children waved small flags while their parents secured spots along the metal barriers. Street vendors sold commemorative badges and cold drinks to the excited crowd. Nobody could have imagined that within the next hour, this peaceful celebration would transform into a moment of terror and heroism that would be remembered for generations. Lieutenant James Morrison stood at attention, near the main platform, where government officials would soon arrive. His red ceremonial uniform was perfectly pressed, and his boots shined like mirrors. James had served in the Royal Guard for 8 years, and this was his 4th time participating in the Independence Day ceremony. He knew every protocol, every movement, and every security measure by heart. But something felt different today. A strange tension hung in the air that he could not explain. The Royal Guard was not just for show. While tourists often stopped to take photographs with the guards in their traditional uniforms, few people understood the intense training these men and women underwent. James had completed military service, advanced tactical training, and countless hours of security assessments. His eyes were trained to spot danger in crowds, to notice unusual behavior, and to react within seconds. Today, those skills would be put to the ultimate test. As the ceremony began, the national anthem played through loudspeakers across the plaza. Everyone stood with hands over hearts, singing along with pride. The Prime Minister and several cabinet members took their places on the raised platform decorated with flowers and national colors. Television cameras captured every moment for the live broadcast, reaching millions of viewers across the country. Security personnel in plain clothes mixed with the crowd, watching carefully for any signs of trouble. James scanned the surrounding buildings as he had been trained to do. The plaza was surrounded by historic structures, some dating back 200 years. Most windows were closed, and security teams had checked every building the night before. But James noticed something odd. On the 3rd floor of the old library building, one window was open just a few inches. It had been closed during the morning inspection. His heart rate increased as he focused on that window. Through years of experience, James had learned to trust his instincts. While everything else appeared normal, that single open window bothered him deeply. He touched his earpiece and quietly reported it to the security command center. They acknowledged his message but reminded him that the building had been cleared. Still, James could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. He adjusted his position slightly to get a better view of the window. While maintaining his ceremonial stance, the crowd applauded as the Prime Minister began his speech. Children sat on their parents' shoulders to see better. News reporters provided commentary for their audiences. Everything seemed perfect, yet James kept his attention divided between the ceremony and that 3rd floor window. Then he saw it just for a split second. A glint of metal catching the sunlight. His blood ran cold. That was not a window, frame, or decoration. That was a rifle barrel. James had perhaps 3 seconds to make a decision that would affect thousands of lives. Protocol said he should report through official channels and wait for orders, but there was no time for that. If someone had positioned a rifle at that window, they were about to take a shot. The Prime Minister stood exposed on the platform, an easy target for any trained shooter. James had sworn an oath to protect his country and its leaders, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. Without thinking about the consequences, James broke formation and sprinted toward the library building. His sudden movement caused confusion among nearby guards and citizens. Some people thought he had fallen ill. Others wondered if this was part of the ceremony. But James had only one thought in his mind: to reach that building before the shooter could fire. His boots pounded against the cobblestones as he ran faster than he ever had in his life. Knowing that every second counted in this race against death, the library building entrance was 50 meters away. But it felt like 50 miles to James. Behind him, he heard shouting from other security personnel demanding to know what was happening. His earpiece filled with urgent voices asking for explanation. But James had no time to respond. He burst through the heavy wooden doors of the library with such force that they slammed against the walls. startling the elderly librarian at the front desk. The woman looked up in shock at this, royal guard running through a quiet library like a madman. Before she could protest, James shouted at her to get down and take cover. The urgency in his voice made her obey without question. She dropped behind her desk while James headed straight for the main staircase. His ceremonial uniform, designed for parades and not running, felt restrictive as he climbed the stairs 2 at a time. The sword at his side bounced awkwardly. His tall ceremonial hat had fallen off somewhere in the plaza. James reached the second-floor landing and kept climbing. His breath came in sharp gasps, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He had done this exact staircase countless times during training exercises, but never had the stakes been so high. The building was eerily quiet, except for his footsteps echoing off the marble floors. Somewhere above him, a would-be assassin was preparing to change history. James refused to let that happen. When he reached the 3rd floor, James slowed down and moved more carefully. He unclipped his ceremonial sword, which despite its decorative appearance, was a real weapon sharp enough to be dangerous. The hallway stretched before him with doors on both sides. He remembered from the security briefing that this floor contained historical archives and reading rooms. One of those rooms had the open window facing the plaza. James moved silently now, checking each door. Most doors were locked, which was normal for archive storage. But near the end of the hallway, one door stood slightly open. James approached it from the side, pressing his back against the wall. Through the gap, he could see bookshelves and sunlight streaming through a window. He also heard something else. The subtle sound of someone breathing, trying to stay quiet but unable to completely silence. The natural rhythm of their breath. James kicked the door open and rushed inside. There, kneeling by the window, was a man in dark clothing with a high-powered sniper rifle mounted on a tripod. The man spun around in shock, clearly not expecting anyone to find him. For a moment, they stared at each other. The sniper was young, maybe late 20s, with cold eyes and steady hands. He had positioned himself perfectly, with the rifle aimed directly at the platform where the Prime Minister stood giving his speech. The sniper reached for a handgun at his belt. But James was faster. He lunged forward and struck the rifle with his sword, knocking it off the tripod. The weapon clattered across the floor away from both men. The sniper grabbed his handgun and aimed it at James, but the guard was already too close. James struck the gun away with another swing of his sword, then tackled the sniper to the ground. They fought desperately on the library floor. The sniper was trained in combat and fought with the desperation of someone who knew capture meant life in prison. He landed several hard punches to James' ribs, causing sharp pain that made breathing difficult. But James had trained for exactly these situations. He blocked a knife, the sniper pulled from his boot and managed to knock it away. The 2 men rolled across the floor, struggling for advantage. James finally gained the upper position and pinned the sniper down. He pressed his forearm against the man's throat with enough pressure to restrict breathing without causing permanent damage. The sniper struggled for another 30 seconds before his resistance weakened. James held him firmly until backup arrived. Within moments, other security personnel stormed into the room. Having finally understood the situation, they quickly handcuffed the sniper and secured the weapons. James stood up slowly, his body aching from the fight. Through the window, he could see the ceremony continuing below. The Prime Minister was still speaking, completely unaware of how close he had come to death. The crowd still cheered and waved their flags. Life in the plaza continued normally because James had stopped a tragedy before it could unfold. The security team leader looked at James with a mixture of respect and disbelief. Nobody had expected a threat to come from inside a supposedly secured building. Nobody had expected one royal guard to break protocol and stop an assassination attempt single-handedly. As they led the captured sniper away, James leaned against the wall, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. News of the attempted assassination spread through security channels within minutes. The ceremony was allowed to continue to avoid public panic, but additional guards surrounded the platform. Snipers on other rooftops went on high alert. Every window and doorway received extra scrutiny. The Prime Minister finished his speech without knowing his life had been saved. By a guard who trusted his instincts over protocol, James was escorted to a secure room in the basement of a nearby government building. His entire body ached from the fight, and medics examined him for injuries. He had bruised ribs, a cut above his left eye, and numerous scrapes on his hands and arms. But he was alive, and more importantly, everyone in the plaza was safe. As the medics treated his wounds, intelligence officers began arriving to question him about everything he had seen and done. The interrogation lasted for 3 hours. They wanted to know every detail about how he spotted the threat, why he broke formation, how he knew which room to enter, and exactly what happened during the fight. James answered each question carefully, explaining his thought process at every step. Some officers praised his quick thinking. Others questioned whether he should have followed proper protocol and reported through channels. James understood their concerns but stood by his decision. There had been no time to wait. Meanwhile, in another room, the captured sniper was being questioned by intelligence agencies. He refused to speak at first, sitting in silence with his arms crossed. But as evidence mounted against him, he realized cooperation might reduce his sentence. Slowly, he began to reveal details about the plot. He was part of a radical group that opposed the government. They had spent months planning this assassination, believing it would spark a revolution. The sniper explained how they had infiltrated the library days before the ceremony. One of their members worked as a maintenance contractor and had access to the building. He had unlocked the archive room window and disabled its alarm sensor. The sniper had entered the building at dawn, dressed as a janitor and hidden in the archive room. He waited there for hours, knowing security sweeps happened before dawn, but not again until after the ceremony. This information shocked the security teams. Their protocols had failed to account for someone hiding inside a building during the security sweep. They had checked the library at 5 in the morning, but never imagined someone would enter afterward using stolen keys. The plot had been sophisticated and well-planned, not for James noticing that open window. The sniper would likely have succeeded in his mission. As the investigation continued, authorities arrested 3 other members of the radical group. They found weapons, false documents, and detailed plans in their hideout. The group had intended to create chaos during the assassination, with members planted in the crowd ready to cause panic and confusion.
Ow.
But with their sniper captured, the entire plan collapsed. The other members were arrested without incident, still waiting in the crowd for a gunshot that would never come. Back in the secure room, James sat alone with his thoughts. The initial adrenaline had completely worn off, replaced by exhaustion and a strange numbness. He had killed men during his military service years ago, but this felt different. This had happened in his own capital city during a celebration. He kept thinking about all the children in the crowd, who would have witnessed something horrible if he had been even 30 seconds slower. The door opened, and the Director of National Security entered. He was a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for being impossible to impress. He sat across from James and studied him for a long moment before speaking. He told James that his actions had saved not just the Prime Minister, but potentially hundreds of lives. If the assassination had succeeded, the group planned to detonate explosives in the panicking crowd. James had stopped a massacre without even knowing the full scope of the threat. The director explained that James' decision to trust his instincts over protocol had created a difficult situation. Some officials argued he should face discipline for abandoning his post. Others insisted he deserved the highest honors. The director said he fell firmly into the second group. He told James that rules and protocols were important, but they existed to serve people, not the other way around. Sometimes the right action meant breaking the rules, and today had been one of those times. James nodded slowly, still processing everything. He asked about the civilians in the library. The director assured him the librarian was safe and had been evacuated along with several researchers who were in other parts of the building. Nobody had been hurt except James and the sniper. The director stood to leave, then paused at the door. He told James to go home, rest, and prepare for media attention. This story would be everywhere by tomorrow morning. By the next morning, James Morrison became the most famous person in the country. Every newspaper ran his photograph on the front page. Television stations played security footage showing him sprinting across the plaza toward the library. News helicopters had captured the moment other guards surrounded the building. Social media exploded with posts calling him a hero and debating whether he deserved a medal or punishment for breaking protocol. James woke up in his small apartment to find reporters camping outside his building. His phone had over 200 missed calls and thousands of messages. His family had been trying to reach him all night, worried and proud at the same time. His mother cried on the phone, saying she always knew he was brave but never imagined seeing him on the news like this. His father, a retired police officer, simply said he was proud. The government moved quickly to control the narrative. They announced that a serious security threat had been neutralized. Thanks to the vigilance and courage of Lieutenant James Morrison, they confirmed the arrest of 4 suspects connected to a radical group. They assured citizens that the Independence Day ceremony had been safe and that additional security measures were being implemented for all future events. The Prime Minister himself gave a televised address thanking James personally for his service, but not everyone saw James as a hero. Some critics argued that he had put the Prime Minister at greater risk by breaking formation and potentially alerting the sniper. Others questioned why security had failed to detect the threat earlier. Opposition politicians demanded an investigation into how someone had infiltrated a supposedly secure building. The media coverage became increasingly polarized, with some outlets praising James while others criticized the entire security apparatus. James tried to avoid the attention by staying inside his apartment, but isolation became its own challenge. He kept replaying the incident in his mind, wondering if he had made the right choices. What if the sniper had shot him first? What if there had been multiple attackers? What if he had been wrong about the window? The questions circled endlessly in his thoughts. Sleep became difficult as his mind refused to quiet down. On the 3rd day after the incident, James received an official summons to appear before a special review board. This board would determine whether his actions warranted commendation or disciplinary measures. Some senior officers believed he had acted heroically. Others felt he had violated fundamental principles of chain of command and protocol. The hearing would decide his future in the Royal Guard and potentially his entire military career. James put on his dress uniform and traveled to military headquarters. Protesters had gathered outside, split into 2 groups. One side held signs supporting James and calling him a national hero. The other side demanded accountability for security failures and questioned whether James had followed proper procedures. Police kept the 2 groups separated, but the tension was obvious. James walked through the middle, trying to ignore the shouting from both sides. The hearing room was formal and intimidating. Senior officers sat behind a long table, their uniforms decorated with medals and ribbons from decades of service. A stenographer recorded every word. Legal representatives sat on both sides, ready to argue their positions. James took his seat and tried to remain calm as the proceedings began. The lead officer explained that this was not a criminal trial, but an administrative review to determine the appropriateness of his actions. For the next 4 hours, James answered questions about his training, his decision-making process, and his understanding of protocol. They showed him diagrams of the plaza and asked why he had not used his radio to report the threat more formally. They questioned whether he had considered alternative responses. They examined every second of his actions, looking for mistakes or violations. James answered honestly, acknowledging that he had broken protocol, but standing by his belief that immediate action had been necessary. The prosecution, such as it was, argued that military discipline requires following orders and protocols even in crisis situations. They suggested that James' personal judgment, however well-intentioned, could not be allowed to override established procedures. If every soldier made independent decisions, command structure would collapse into chaos. They acknowledged his bravery but maintained that discipline must be preserved, and his actions set a dangerous precedent. The defense countered that protocols exist to serve objectives, not become obstacles to those objectives. James' primary duty was protecting the Prime Minister and the public. He had identified a credible threat that others missed and neutralized it before anyone was harmed. Rigid adherence to reporting procedures would have resulted in assassination and mass casualties. They argued that James had demonstrated exactly the kind of initiative and courage that the ROHRWHA was supposed to represent. Witnesses testified throughout the day. The security team leader admitted that the window had been mentioned but not deemed urgent. The librarian described how James had warned her to take cover, potentially saving her life. Intelligence officers confirmed that the plot was real and imminent. Medical examiners showed photographs of James' injuries from the fight, demonstrating that he had risked his life in hand-to-hand combat with an armed assassin. Each testimony added another layer to the complex picture of that morning. The hearing concluded late in the afternoon. The review board announced they would deliberate overnight before announcing their decision. James left the building exhausted and emotionally drained. The media swarmed him with questions, but his legal representative advised him to say nothing. He pushed through the crowd and got into a waiting car that took him back to his apartment. That evening, James sat alone watching news coverage of the hearing. Experts debated the outcome on television. Some predicted he would receive a medal. Others thought he might face suspension or discharge. The uncertainty was agonizing. James had devoted his adult life to military service and the Royal Guard. The thought of losing his career over doing what he believed was right filled him with anxiety. His phone rang around 9 in the evening. It was his old training instructor, a retired sergeant who had taught James everything about being a Royal Guard. The sergeant told James that regardless of what the board decided, he had made his instructor proud. He reminded James that their oath was to protect lives, not to follow paperwork. True soldiers know when to obey orders and when to trust their training and instincts. James thanked him, feeling better than he had in days. The next morning, James returned to military headquarters for the announcement. The room was packed with media, military personnel, and government officials. The lead officer of the review board stood and read from a prepared statement. He acknowledged that Lieutenant Morrison had violated protocol by leaving his post without proper authorization. However, the board had determined that his actions were justified given the extreme circumstances and immediate threat to life. The officer continued, explaining that the board recognized James had demonstrated exceptional situational awareness, decisive action, and physical courage. His ability to identify a threat that others missed likely prevented a national tragedy. While the board emphasized that protocol violations would not normally be tolerated, this case represented an extraordinary situation requiring extraordinary action. Therefore, they had decided that no disciplinary measures would be imposed, but the announcement did not end there. The officer revealed that the Prime Minister himself had requested a special recognition ceremony. James Morrison would receive the Medal of Valor, the highest honor for courage and service to the nation. Additionally, he would be promoted to the rank of captain and given a new position, training other Royal Guards in threat assessment and crisis response. The room erupted in applause. James stood there in shock, barely able to process what he was hearing. He had prepared himself for possible discharge or demotion. Instead, he was being honored and promoted. When the officer asked if he had anything to say, James struggled to find words. He simply thanked the board, his fellow guards, and everyone who had supported him. He dedicated his actions to all the families who had been in the plaza that day. Safe because of decisions made in seconds, the media coverage shifted dramatically after the announcement. James became a symbol of courage and quick thinking. Schools invited him to speak to students about service and bravery. Other countries sent messages congratulating the Royal Guard and requesting information about training procedures. James found himself representing not just himself but the entire military and security community. The formal medal ceremony took place 2 weeks later in the same plaza where the incident had occurred. This time, security was even tighter with no chances taken. Thousands of citizens gathered to watch as the Prime Minister personally pinned the Medal of Valor to James' uniform. The Prime Minister spoke about how democracy depends on people willing to stand between danger and innocent lives. James represented the best of that tradition. After receiving his medal, James gave a brief speech. He thanked everyone but emphasized that he was not alone in protecting the country. Thousands of guards, soldiers, police officers, and security personnel worked every day to keep citizens safe. Most would never receive medals or recognition, but their service was equally important. He asked people to remember all those who serve quietly, doing their duty without expecting praise or reward. The ceremony ended with the national anthem. And this time, James could enjoy the moment without scanning buildings for threats. He stood at attention, feeling the weight of the metal on his chest and the pride of knowing he had fulfilled his duty. Around him, other guards stood equally proud, each one ready to do exactly what James had done if circumstances demanded it. Life slowly returned to normal over the following months. James began his new role training other guards, sharing the lessons he had learned. He taught them to trust their instincts while respecting protocol, to observe carefully, and to be ready to act when seconds matter. His students listened carefully, knowing they learned from someone who had faced the ultimate test and succeeded. The attempted assassination became a case study in training programs around the world. 1 year after the incident, James Morrison stood before a new class of Royal Guard recruits. They looked at him with respect and curiosity, knowing his story, but eager to hear it directly from him. He told them about the importance of training, awareness, and trusting yourself when everything is happening too fast for committee decisions. But he also warned them about the weight of such choices and the difficulty of living with moments when split-second decisions determine who lives and who dies. The captured sniper and his accomplices went to trial 6 months after their arrest. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Security footage, weapons, communications, and their own confessions left no doubt about their intentions. The sniper received a sentence of 30 years in prison. His accomplices received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. The judge called their plot an attack not just on the Prime Minister, but on democracy itself and on all the innocent people who had gathered to celebrate their nation. During the trial, new details emerged about how close the plot had come to succeeding. Ballistics experts testified that the sniper had a clear shot and would likely have hit his target. Explosives experts examined the bombs that other group members had planned to detonate in the crowd. The devices were sophisticated and would have caused massive casualties. James had not just stopped an assassination. He had prevented what could have been one of the deadliest terrorist attacks in the nation's history. James attended one day of the trial, sitting in the back of the courtroom. He watched the sniper, trying to understand what could drive someone to want to kill so many innocent people. The man showed no remorse, even claiming he was a patriot fighting against a corrupt government. James felt no satisfaction in seeing him convicted. There was no victory in any of this, only relief that tragedy had been prevented, and justice was being served. The incident led to major changes in security protocols across the country. Buildings near ceremonial sites now required continuous monitoring rather than single sweeps. New technology was installed to detect when windows opened in secure zones. Guard training programs were redesigned to emphasize individual initiative alongside discipline. The balance between following orders and trusting personal judgment became a central focus of military education. James married his longtime girlfriend, Sarah, in a quiet ceremony attended by family and close friends. She had stood by him through all the media attention and difficult months. She understood the weight he carried from that day and helped him process the trauma of violence and near tragedy. They bought a small house outside the capital where James could retreat from public attention when needed. Life became more peaceful, though he remained committed to his service and training responsibilities. Years passed, and the incident slowly faded from daily news coverage. Though it remained an important part of national history, James continued rising through military ranks, eventually becoming a senior officer responsible for security planning at major events. He never forgot the lesson of that Independence Day morning that protecting lives sometimes means making difficult choices without time for approval or consensus, and that the responsibility of such choices stays with you forever. He often thought about the randomness of it all. If he had been positioned 20 meters to the left, he might not have seen the window. If he had hesitated even 10 seconds longer, the sniper might have fired. If the security sweep had been more thorough, the entire incident might have been prevented before it reached the point of crisis. Life balanced on such small moments, and James had been in the right place with the right training and the willingness to act. On the 5th anniversary of the incident, a memorial was erected in the plaza, honoring all security personnel who served to protect citizens. James attended the dedication but declined to speak, preferring to let others take recognition. The memorial featured names of officers killed in the line of duty over the years, reminding everyone that not all stories end as fortunately as his had. James laid flowers at the memorial and stood in silence, thinking about all those who serve without expecting glory. That evening, James returned home to Sarah and their young daughter, Emma. She was too young to understand her father's history, knowing only that he wore a uniform and worked to keep people safe. He watched her play in their garden, her laughter filling the air with innocent joy. This was what he had fought to protect that morning 5 years ago, the simple, precious normalness of families living their lives without fear. James never regretted his decision to break protocol and sprint toward danger while everyone else stood still. The weight of responsibility was heavy, but it was a weight he would carry again without hesitation. He had learned that being a hero was not about seeking glory or recognition. It was about being ready to do what needed to be done when the moment arrived, regardless of cost or consequence. It was about choosing the right action even when rules said otherwise, and living with whatever followed. As darkness fell and lights came on in houses across the neighborhood, James felt a deep sense of peace. The medal sat in a drawer somewhere, rarely looked at anymore. The news articles had yellowed and been archived. But the lives saved that day continued forward, creating ripples through time in ways that could never be fully measured. Families grew, children became adults. Love and life continued because one guard had trusted his instincts and acted when action was needed. That legacy mattered far more than any medal or recognition ever could.